It was a bitterly cold night in Chicago, and the wind cut through the streets like a knife. The streets were almost empty, with only a few scattered pedestrians hurrying along, clutching their coats tightly to their bodies. Snowflakes drifted down lazily, settling on the sidewalks, and the city lights reflected off the frozen ground, giving the streets an eerie glow. In a parked van, positioned under a flickering streetlight, 3 figures sat in silence. Mark, the driver, gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled hold. He was in his mid-30s, his hair slightly disheveled, and his eyes carrying the weight of a decision that had taken far too long to make. Every few seconds, his leg would bounce restlessly, and his fingers would tap an uneven rhythm on the steering wheel, as if trying to expel the nervous energy building inside him. He glanced up at the rearview mirror, where he could just see the frail figure of his grandmother sitting in the back seat, her small frame barely illuminated by the dim light from the dashboard. Next to him, Julia sat with her head turned toward the window, her eyes glassy and distant. She looked to be in her late 20s, wearing a thick scarf wrapped around her neck, but even that couldn't hide the way her shoulders trembled, not from the cold, but from the emotion welling up inside her. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and tears threatened to spill down her cheeks, but she blinked them back furiously, refusing to let them fall. Guilt gnawed at her insides, a relentless ache that had been growing stronger as the night went on. In the back seat was Evelyn, their grandmother. She was hunched over, her body wrapped in an old faded coat that had long since lost its ability to keep out the cold. Her silver hair was pulled into a loose bun, strands escaping and framing a face lined with years of laughter, sorrow, and everything in between. Despite her frail appearance, there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes as she looked from Mark to Julia and then out the window, watching the snowflakes fall. She had sensed the tension between her grandchildren, but she didn't want to pry. She trusted them. She had always trusted them. "Are we almost there?" Evelyn asked, her voice soft and trembling, the words barely cutting through the silence in the car. Mark glanced at Julia, who couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. "Yeah, Grandma, we're almost there," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just wanted to take you for a drive, clear your head, you know." Evelyn nodded, the movement slow and careful. "That's sweet of you," she murmured, though a flicker of doubt passed over her features. There was something in the way they were behaving that didn't sit right with her, but she dismissed it, convincing herself it was just her old mind playing tricks on her. The van came to a stop and Mark killed the engine. They had arrived in a narrow, dimly lit alleyway surrounded by looming brick buildings and piles of snow. The place was deserted, eerily quiet, and far from any main roads. Evelyn looked around, confusion knitting her brows together. "Why are we stopping here?" she asked, her voice wavering. Mark turned around in his seat, forcing another smile. "We thought it would be a good place for you to rest for a bit. There's a shelter not too far from here. They'll take care of you," he explained, his tone overly bright as though he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Julia finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just for a little while, Grandma. We can't take care of you right now," she said, the words breaking her heart as she spoke them. Evelyn's eyes widened, and for a moment she just stared at them, her mind struggling to process what was happening. You're leaving me here?" she asked, her voice trembling. The betrayal was sharp, like ice slipping into her veins, and she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "It's for the best, Grandma," Mark said, unable to meet her gaze. "You'll be fine. They'll help you." Without another word, he got out of the van and walked around to open the door for Evelyn. She stepped out, her legs shaky, and stood there in the snow, watching as her grandchildren got back into the van. The engine roared to life, and she watched, numb, as they drove away, the taillights disappearing into the darkness. She stood there for a long moment, unable to move, unable to comprehend what had just happened. As the cold began to seep into her bones, Evelyn finally took a step forward, her eyes brimming with tears. She glanced around, seeing nothing but snow-covered streets and shadowed alleys. Her breath puffed out in little clouds, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself, but it did little to ward off the chill that had settled deep in her heart. Her legs felt heavy, each step a monumental effort as she began to walk, leaving footprints in the freshly fallen snow. The wind picked up, biting against her skin, and Evelyn shivered violently. She felt lost, abandoned in more ways than one, and every step seemed to take her further into a darkness that she couldn't escape. Memories of her grandchildren played through her mind, memories of happier times, and the pain of their betrayal cut deeper with every step. How could they do this to her? How could the children she had loved and raised leave her in the cold like this? Hours seemed to pass, though it could have been minutes or days. Evelyn couldn't tell. Her fingers and toes had long since gone numb, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She felt herself growing weaker with each step, her body slowing as if it too had given up. But just as she was about to collapse, she heard something. A soft, distant sound carried on the wind. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder as she trudged forward, her ears straining to catch it. It was singing, sweet and gentle, rising and falling like a lullaby. With the last of her strength, Evelyn followed the sound, her feet dragging through the snow. As she turned a corner, she saw it, a small chapel, warm light spilling out from the stained glass windows, the door slightly ajar. The singing was coming from inside, filling the air with a sense of peace and hope. Evelyn took a shaky step forward, then another, until she was standing in front of the door. With trembling hands, she pushed it open, and a rush of warmth enveloped her. Inside, a small congregation was gathered, singing together, their voices rising in perfect harmony. At the front stood Father James, a kind-looking man with gentle eyes, who paused mid-song as he saw Evelyn standing in the doorway. "Come in," he said softly, extending a hand to her. "You're safe here." Evelyn's legs gave out and she fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. For the first time that night she felt warmth, not just from the building but from the kindness that surrounded her. She had been abandoned, left in the cold by the very people she loved the most, but here, in this little chapel, she had found a glimmer of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness. Evelyn was carefully guided into the warm, glowing interior of the chapel by Father James, who gently helped her to her feet and offered her a chair near the small hearth in the corner. The room was simple, with wooden pews and a plain altar at the front, but it radiated warmth and comfort in a way that Evelyn hadn't felt in years. The singing slowly quieted as the congregation turned to look at the stranger who had stumbled in from the cold, their faces filled with curiosity and compassion. Father James sat across from Evelyn, his eyes never leaving her face as she struggled to catch her breath. "You're safe now," he said in a calm, reassuring voice. "Take your time." He handed her a steaming cup of tea, the warmth spreading through her cold, stiff fingers. Evelyn took a sip, the hot liquid soothing her dry throat, and for the first time in hours, she felt a tiny bit of warmth spread through her body. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked, and instead she could only manage a slight nod of gratitude. The congregation began to disperse, whispering softly among themselves, but several of them lingered, offering gentle smiles and kind words before leaving her alone with Father James. "I've seen many people walk through these doors," Father James said, breaking the silence, "but I've never seen someone look as lost as you do." His eyes softened. "What happened?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she couldn't bring herself to answer. But there was something about the warmth in Father James's eyes, the way he looked at her without judgment or pity, that made her feel safe enough to speak. "My grandchildren," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They left me. They brought me here, and they left me." Father James listened patiently as Evelyn recounted her story, each word heavy with the pain and betrayal she felt. She told him about Mark and Julia, about how she had raised them after their parents died, how she had sacrificed everything to ensure they had a good life. She spoke of the years she had spent caring for them, loving them, and how, as they grew older, they had begun to drift away, caught up in their own lives. And finally, she told him about that night, the night they left her alone in the cold without so much as a goodbye. By the time she finished, Evelyn was sobbing, the tears flowing freely down her cheeks, and Father James reached out to take her hand. "You are not alone," he said softly. "You have found your way to us, and we will be your family now." For the next few days, Evelyn stayed in the small room at the back of the chapel that Father James had offered her. It was modest, with a narrow bed and a small window that looked out onto the snowy street. But to Evelyn it felt like a palace compared to the cold alley where she had been abandoned. Every morning she would wake to the sound of the church bells ringing, and she would help with the small tasks that needed to be done, sweeping the floors, polishing the pews, preparing meals for those who came seeking help. Slowly, Evelyn began to feel a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in years. The church community welcomed her with open arms. never asking questions or demanding explanations. They treated her with kindness and respect, and in their company, Evelyn began to heal. The pain of her grandchildren's betrayal still lingered, but it no longer felt like a weight that threatened to crush her. Instead, it became a part of her story, a story that was far from over. One evening after the congregation had left and the chapel was quiet, Father James sat with Evelyn by the fire. "You have been through so much," he said gently, "but you are still standing. You have a strength that not many possess." Evelyn looked down at her hands, worn and wrinkled, the hands of someone who had lived a long and difficult life. "I don't feel strong," she admitted. "I feel broken." "That's because you haven't allowed yourself to let go of the pain," Father James said. "You've been carrying it for so long that it's become a part of you. But you have the power to choose what you do with that pain. You can let it consume you, or you can use it to create something beautiful." Evelyn listened to his words, and something inside her shifted. "I want to forgive them," she said quietly, "but I don't know how." "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Father James replied. "It means choosing to move forward, to find peace despite the hurt. And perhaps it begins with telling them how you feel." Together they sat down that night and began to write. The letter was long and full of emotion, each word carefully chosen, each sentence a reflection of Evelyn's pain, her love, and her hope. She wrote about the years she had spent caring for Mark and Julia, about the joy they had brought to her life, and about the deep sorrow she felt when they left her. But she also wrote about the kindness she had found in the church, about the warmth and compassion that had helped her heal. And finally she wrote of forgiveness, not as an absolution of their actions, but as a way to free herself from the pain that had held her captive. When the letter was finished, Father James read it aloud, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. It was shared with the congregation, and as it spread, it touched the hearts of everyone who read it. Strangers wept for Evelyn's pain, and donations began pouring in: money, food, clothing, gifts from people who wanted to help this woman who had been so cruelly abandoned. It wasn't long before the letter found its way to Mark and Julia. They had been going about their lives trying to ignore the nagging guilt that haunted them since that night. When they received the letter, Mark was the first to open it, and as he read, his hands began to shake. By the time he reached the end, tears streamed down his face, and he handed it to Julia, who read it with trembling hands, her heart breaking with each word. "We have to go back," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have to make this right." But their motivations weren't entirely pure. As they learned of the donations Evelyn had received, a small, selfish thought crept into their minds. They convinced themselves that they needed to help manage the funds to ensure that their grandmother wasn't taken advantage of. And so they returned to the church ready to bring Evelyn back into their lives, not out of love, but out of a desire to control what they believed was rightfully theirs. Evelyn was in the chapel lighting candles when she saw them standing in the doorway. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she felt the old ache return. But as she looked into their eyes, she saw not the remorse or love she had hoped for, but a cold calculation. They hadn't come to apologize. They had come to take. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "We've come to take you home, Grandma," Julia said, forcing a smile. "We've been so worried about you." Evelyn shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "No," she said simply. "I'm not going back with you." Mark stepped forward, his expression hardening. "You can't stay here forever. This isn't your home." Evelyn stood tall, her back straight, and for the first time in years, she felt the strength that Father James had seen in her. "I have found more love and kindness here than I ever felt with you," she said. "You left me, you made your choice, and now I am making mine." Julia's eyes filled with tears, but Mark's expression turned to anger. "You can't do this," he snapped. "We're your family." "Family is more than blood," Evelyn replied, her voice calm and unwavering. "It's love, compassion, and respect. And I have found a family here." As Mark and Julia stood there, stunned into silence, Father James stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "She is where she belongs," he said quietly, "and she is stronger than you could ever imagine." Mark and Julia left the chapel that night, defeated but not yet ready to give up. They would not let Evelyn go so easily, and as they walked into the darkness, their minds turned to other ways they could regain control. But Evelyn stood her ground, her heart no longer burdened by the pain of their betrayal. She had faced the darkness and found the strength she didn't know she possessed. Each day that passed in the chapel was a reminder of how far she had come, of how much she had endured, and of the life she had reclaimed despite the odds. The community welcomed her with open arms, and she quickly became an integral part of the church's daily activities. Father James, who had become her confidant and guide, marveled at her resilience. She learned how to cook for the soup kitchen that the church ran every evening. Her hands, once gnarled from age and hardship, now moving with renewed energy as she chopped vegetables and stirred steaming pots of soup. The aroma of the food filled the hall, and Evelyn felt a sense of purpose, of belonging, that had long been missing from her life. Each day brought new faces to the kitchen, people from all walks of life seeking solace and a warm meal, and with each person she served, Evelyn felt a little more of her strength return. One afternoon, as she sat with Father James in the quiet of the chapel, she spoke about her past, the years of raising Mark and Julia, the sacrifices she had made, and the emptiness that had filled her heart when they turned away from her. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were no longer the tears of a woman who felt defeated. They were the tears of someone who had found her way back to herself. Father James listened patiently, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've carried a heavy burden for so long, Evelyn," he said gently, "but you've shown more courage than many people I've known in my lifetime. It takes a strong heart to forgive." Evelyn nodded, her fingers clutching the edges of her worn-out coat. "I've learned that forgiveness isn't just about the people who've hurt you. It's about freeing yourself from the pain, from the chains that keep you anchored in the past." She sighed, her gaze drifting to the stained glass window that bathed the chapel in soft hues of red and blue. "I need to write to them, Father. I need to let them know that I forgive them, not for their sake, but for mine." Father James smiled and nodded. "Then let's do that. Let's help you find the words." Over the next few days, Evelyn poured her heart into the letter. She wrote about the love she still carried for Mark and Julia, despite everything they had done. She spoke of her pain, but more importantly, she spoke of her journey toward forgiveness. She didn't hold back. She wanted them to know that even though they had abandoned her, she had found a way to rise above the darkness. As she sealed the letter, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, as if the act of putting her thoughts on paper had allowed her to release the last of her sorrow. The letter found its way to Mark and Julia, delivered to their doorstep by a kind member of the church who had offered to help. They opened it together, sitting at the same kitchen table where they had once made the fateful decision to abandon their grandmother. As they read Evelyn's words, a silence fell between them, thicker and more suffocating than the winter air outside. Mark swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he placed the letter on the table. "She forgives us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Julia's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since that night she let herself cry. "How could she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "After everything we did, how could she still love us?" Mark shook his head, unable to find an answer. He had always prided himself on being tough, on making the hard decisions. But now, faced with the kindness and strength of the woman they had wronged, he felt like a child who had lost his way. It wasn't long before the story of Evelyn's journey spread beyond the walls of the church. News outlets picked up on her story, and donations began to pour in from people who were moved by her resilience, by her capacity to forgive even the deepest wounds. Strangers sent letters of encouragement, sharing their own stories of pain and redemption, and with each one, Evelyn felt her spirit grow stronger. The money that came in was used to support the church's programs, helping feed the homeless, provide shelter for those in need, and offer warmth to those who, like Evelyn, had found themselves lost in the cold. When Mark and Julia heard about the donations, their minds immediately turned to how they could capitalize on the newfound attention. They had never imagined that Evelyn's story would resonate with so many people, nor did they anticipate the wave of generosity that would follow. Driven by greed and a twisted sense of entitlement, they decided to confront Evelyn once more, this time determined to regain control of what they believed was rightfully theirs. One cold evening, they returned to the church, stepping into the warmth and light with hesitant, nervous steps. Evelyn was sitting by the fireplace in the main hall, a book resting in her lap, when she saw them enter. For a moment, they simply stood there, shuffling awkwardly before Mark cleared his throat. "Grandma," he began, his voice wavering, "we need to talk." Evelyn looked up, her eyes meeting his with a calmness that caught him off guard. "I figured you'd be back," she said simply, her voice steady. "What is it you want?" Julia stepped forward, her face flushed. "We heard about the donations," she blurted out, "and we thought you might need help managing them." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "You think I need your help?" she asked, her voice tinged with both disbelief and pity. "You left me out there in the cold to fend for myself. Now that I've found a bit of warmth, you think you can just come back and take it from me?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, a hint of frustration creeping into his tone. "We're family, Grandma. We should be the ones looking after you, making sure you're taken care of." Evelyn shook her head. "Family doesn't abandon each other, Mark. Family doesn't leave their own to suffer because they're too burdened by responsibility." Her voice grew stronger, each word carrying the weight of her journey, the pain and the strength she had found. "I've spent my whole life taking care of you two. Now it's time I take care of myself." Julia's eyes welled with tears. "We're sorry, Grandma," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We're so sorry." Evelyn reached out and took her granddaughter's hand, her grip firm yet gentle. "I forgive you," she said softly, her eyes shining with a warmth that seemed to drive away the chill of the night. "But I won't let you control me anymore. I've found my strength and I'm not going to give it up for anyone." As Mark and Julia stood there, struggling to understand the woman before them, Father James entered the room. "It's getting late," he said kindly, glancing at Evelyn. "Why don't we continue this conversation tomorrow?" Mark clenched his jaw but nodded. "We'll be back," he muttered, his tone laced with a hint of defiance. Evelyn watched them leave, the door closing behind them with a soft click. For a long moment she stared after them, her heart heavy with both sorrow and hope. But as she turned back to the fireplace, the warmth of the flames enveloping her, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had faced the darkness, she had fought her way through the cold, through the pain, and now she was finally free. And that, she realized, was worth more than any donation, any apology, or any promise that her grandchildren could ever offer. Mark and Julia were not ready to let go. After leaving the church that night, they stewed in silence, anger and frustration mingling with the guilt they felt. They believed that they had a right to Evelyn's newfound fortune, that her story and the sympathy it garnered belonged to them as much as it did to her. And so they hatched a plan, one that would put them back in control of her life. A few weeks later, Evelyn received an official-looking letter at the church. It was from a law firm representing Mark and Julia, and its contents left her reeling. They were suing for guardianship, claiming that Evelyn was mentally incompetent and incapable of managing her own affairs. According to the letter, they intended to prove in court that Evelyn was unfit to handle the donations, and that they, as her family, should be the ones to oversee her finances and care. The news spread quickly through the church community, and an air of disbelief settled over everyone. Father James looked at Evelyn with concern as they sat together in his small office, the letter lying open on the desk between them. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" he asked gently. "This could be a long and difficult battle." Evelyn straightened her shoulders, her eyes hardening with resolve. "I've come too far to let them take away my independence now," she replied firmly. "I won't let them put me back in a cage, not after everything I've fought to overcome." The day of the court hearing arrived, and Evelyn stepped into the courtroom with her head held high. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her silver hair neatly pinned back, and there was an air of quiet dignity about her that commanded respect. Father James accompanied her, along with several members of the church community who had come to offer their support. Mark and Julia were already there, sitting at a table with their lawyer, their faces tight with determination. The trial began, and Mark's lawyer wasted no time in painting a picture of Evelyn as a frail, confused old woman who had been taken advantage of by the church community. He described her as incapable of making sound decisions, citing her age and supposed forgetfulness as evidence of her incompetence. He portrayed Mark and Julia as the concerned, loving grandchildren who only wanted to protect their grandmother from being exploited. Evelyn listened to every word, her face impassive, but inside her heart ached. It was as if they were trying to erase everything she had endured, every step she had taken to reclaim her life, and reduce her to nothing more than a burden, a helpless old woman who couldn't fend for herself. When it was her turn to speak, Evelyn took a deep breath and stood, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. The room fell silent as she began to speak, her voice clear and unwavering. "I may be old," she began, her eyes locking onto Mark and Julia's, "but I am not weak. I have lived through more hardship than most people could imagine. I raised my grandchildren when their parents couldn't, and I did so with love, patience, and a heart full of hope. And when they left me, when they abandoned me in the cold, I didn't crumble. I found my way. I found a new family, a new sense of purpose. I am not the frail, helpless woman they want you to believe I am." She paused, letting her words sink in, and then continued, her voice growing stronger. "My grandchildren made a choice to leave me behind, but I made a choice to live. I found a community that welcomed me with open arms, that gave me the strength to stand on my own 2 feet. I do not need anyone to control my life, least of all the people who tried to strip me of my dignity." Tears glistened in the eyes of those who had come to support her, and even the judge seemed moved by her words. Mark and Julia shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her gaze. When Evelyn finished, she sat down, her body trembling slightly but her spirit unbroken. The courtroom buzzed with a sense of awe, as if everyone present could feel the weight of her journey, the courage it had taken for her to stand up and speak her truth. In the end, the judge ruled in Evelyn's favor. He recognized her ability to manage her own life, stating that she was more than capable of making decisions for herself. Mark and Julia's case was dismissed, and they were ordered to cease any further attempts to gain control over her affairs. As the gavel struck, a wave of relief washed over Evelyn, and she allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. She had won, not just the legal battle, but the fight for her freedom. After the hearing, Mark and Julia approached Evelyn outside the courthouse. For a moment, they stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to say. Finally, Julia broke the silence, her voice small and broken. "We're sorry, Grandma," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We were wrong. We were so wrong." Evelyn looked at them, her eyes softening. "I forgive you," she said simply. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I'm going to forget what you did. I love you both, but I need to live my life on my own terms now." Mark nodded, swallowing hard. "We understand," he murmured. We hope you'll let us be a part of your life again someday." Evelyn reached out and took their hands in hers, giving them a gentle squeeze. "That day will come," she said softly, "but it will be on my terms." Evelyn returned to the church that evening, and the congregation welcomed her back with open arms. The chapel was filled with music and laughter, and the warmth of the community enveloped her like a soft blanket. They had all come to celebrate not just her victory in court, but her triumph over the pain and betrayal that had once defined her life. As the evening drew to a close, Father James stood up and called for everyone's attention. "Tonight, we celebrate Evelyn," he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "We celebrate her strength, her courage, and her unyielding spirit. She has shown us all what it means to fight for yourself, to forgive even when it seems impossible, and to never give up on the ones you love." A cheer erupted from the crowd, and Evelyn felt her heart swell with gratitude. She had found a family here, one that accepted her, flaws and all. She had faced the darkness and emerged on the other side stronger and more resilient than ever before. Father James reached out his hand, and Evelyn took it, allowing him to lead her to the center of the room. The soft strains of a familiar tune filled the air, and they began to dance, slowly at first, but with growing confidence. As they moved together, Evelyn felt a sense of joy that she hadn't felt in years. It was as if every step she took was a declaration of her freedom, of her newfound strength. As the music swirled around them, Evelyn closed her eyes and let herself be carried away. She wasn't just an old woman who had been abandoned. She was a warrior, a survivor, and she had found her way back to the light. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of her new family, she knew that she would never be alone again. The days that followed were filled with more letters, more visitors, and more stories of people who had found strength in Evelyn's journey. Her story became an inspiration, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the unbreakable bonds of love. People from all walks of life reached out to her, thanking her for showing them that even in the face of betrayal and heartache, there was always hope. Evelyn continued to live at the church, surrounded by the people who had become her family. She tended to the garden, cooked meals for those in need, and shared her story with anyone who would listen. And every time she spoke, she felt the pain of her past grow a little dimmer, replaced by the warmth of the love she had found. In time, Mark and Julia returned to visit her, no longer as adversaries but as family. They joined her at the church, helping with the soup kitchen and volunteering their time. It wasn't an easy road, and there were still moments of pain and regret, but slowly they began to rebuild the bond that had been broken. And Evelyn welcomed them, not as the grandchildren who had abandoned her, but as the children she had always loved. Evelyn's story was a reminder to all who heard it that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way forward. That family is not just about blood ties, but about the love, forgiveness, and resilience that bind us together. And as she stood in the chapel surrounded by her new family, Evelyn knew that her journey was far from over. It was only just beginning.